small but illustrious crowd of people have found their way on this day when everybody is already on the way home to celebrate Passover, Easter, whatever. Nonetheless, we have a good audience, and that is no doubt due to Gülru Göker's arrival here on Wednesday from Sabancı University. We have this new institutional exchange with Sabancı University that every spring we are exchanging faculty. So we have faculty guests from Sabancı University at Columbia, and usually a Columbia professor is also going to Sabancı University to give a lecture, to participate in meetings, sit in on classes, depending on what the specific interest is of faculty members coming here or going there. And the idea about this is to actually foster relationships between disciplines, between colleagues, to come up with research agendas for the future. And I hope that this new exchange, which we started only last year, I think, will bear fruit in the near and more distant future. So we are very delighted to have Zeynep Gülru Göker here with us, who is an associate professor of political science at Sabancı University and has been a professor and a faculty member there since 2021. She earned her BA degree at Sabancı University in social and political science, then received an MA, MPhil, and PhD in political science here at CUNY, at the Graduate Center. She was a postdoctoral fellow at Koç University. She was also an instructor at Koç University before becoming, again, a postdoc and then a researcher at Sabancı University between 2017 and 21, before she became a faculty member at Sabancı University, where she is also since 2023 the director of the Center for Excellence for Gender and Women's Studies. Zeynep Gülru Göker has published widely on various aspects of her focus area, namely gender and politics, gender equality politics, feminist political theory, deliberative democracy, and care ethics. And I welcome her and you all to Columbia and to listen to her talk on a feminist rethinking of republicanism at the start of the second centenary of the Republic of Turkey, in which she invites us to rethink the relationship between feminism and republicanism at the beginning of the second centenary of the Republic. So welcome, Gülru, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Professor Holger Klein and the Executive Committee of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies, and Associate Director Sümeyye Yar for facilitating this exchange, for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here and among esteemed professors and colleagues, some of whom I know, so it's a nice surprise to see you here. And it's always great to be back in New York, where, as he said, I completed my PhD in 2011 at the CUNY Graduate Center. So, my talk is entitled Feminist Rethinking of Republicanism at the Start of the Second Centenary of the Republic of Turkey. I'll be going back between the Republic and the Republicanism, between what exists and the ideal, and reflecting on, try to share my reflections on the beginning of the first centenary and the beginning of the so-called second centenary of the Republic of Turkey, and see, what this exchange between republicanism and feminism can take us to, what kind of normative and empirical directions for research it can provide to us. So, as the Republic of Turkey enters its second centennial in a context of increasing authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, and anti-gender mobilizations, scholarly debates evaluating the first 100 years of the Republic from gender perspectives have emerged since 2023 onwards. Distinguished scholars have participated in interviews and contributed commentaries addressing the evolution, advancement, and the present status of gender equality and feminism. These commentaries also assess the continuity and transformation of gender equality and feminist movements from the early years of the Republic to the present. However, feminist scholarship in Turkey has centered on the Republic with a capital R, and not as much on Republicanism as a comprehensive body of political thought. To date, there has been limited to almost no engagement with Republicanism as a theoretical framework. This phenomena is not exclusive to Turkey. Across the world, Republican political theory has been critically received by feminist political theorists. As Anne Phillips has argued in an article written 25 years ago in 2000, during a period marked by a resurgence of interest in republicanism, feminism and republicanism are at best reluctant allies. Despite some shared concerns, such as the critique of interest-driven politics, feminism remained largely skeptical of republicanism, due to a justifiable hesitancy to place trust in Republican men when it comes to the notions of public good, the interpretation of what the public concerns in the public good, and which often leaves crucial aspects of women's lives outside the purview of politics. This reluctance also stems from the fact that in the earliest republics, women were not regarded as equal citizens or as citizens at all. The establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923 and the subsequent Kemalist modernization process were indisputably pivotal in the advancement of women's rights. By divesting patriarchy of its religious legitimation, the Republican regime was sought to facilitate women's enhanced access to the public sphere, entry into education and workforce in large numbers, and to a certain extent also involvement in politics, albeit with limitations. As Ayşe Kadıoğlu has astutely observed, as in the context of most grand social projects, in the Turkish modernization process as well, the feminine object of modernization and nation building was desexualized, orderly, and chaste, and it was the presence of women in the public sphere that sometimes gained predominance over their active inclusion. The establishment of the state was regarded as the domain of men, according to Serbil Sancar, while the construction of the home was attributed to women. Women's primary role was considered to be social reproduction, and motherhood was regarded as a national role that extended to the public sphere in occupations such as teaching. Some of these roles are said to resemble Republican motherhood paradigm of the 18th and 19th centuries, which assigned women a more active role in social reproduction and promoted women's education, but came at the cost of the regulation of sexuality and emphasis on moral purity. In early Republican Turkey, the ideology, which I use a term used by Şirin Tekeli in 1984, of state feminism, emphasized the importance of having educated mothers as the teachers of an educated nation, and did not interfere with relations of domination at work around the economy of social reproduction. Subsequent feminist interpretations of the Kemalist modernization process, as reflected in a retrospective assessment conducted in honor of the 75th anniversary of the Republic, have characterized it as offering limited opportunities for women's political engagement. These interpretations contend that the process instrumentalized women's rights, primarily benefiting middle and upper class women, while simultaneously generating new forms of exclusion based on class, ethnic, and religious lines. According to Deniz Kandiyoti, emancipation did not inherently lead to liberation, and private patriarchy was left intact. The fraternal contract, as Berktay referred to it a couple of years ago in reference to Carol Pateman's work, did not bring an end to patriarchy, but rather served to reinforce it. So 100 years on, what we're witnessing in Turkey with increasing force since the 2010s and perhaps more, is the push for an establishment of a new fraternal contract that is anti-gender, anti-feminist, and anti-LGBTI+. This new contractual arrangement is directly promoted by the government and backed by some conservative religious groups, organizations, right-wing populist media. In the Justice and Development Party government's push to draft a new constitution for Turkey's new centennial, as it's referred by the government, the Türkiye century, there's a discursive but also increasingly also materialized, I would say, emphasis on the family rather than as on individual citizen as party to the social contract. In fact, 2025 has been proclaimed as the year of the family. These developments are also not unique to Turkey either. For some years now, anti-gender politics and democratic backsliding have been mutually reinforcing each other around the world, and gender equality, as Lombardo, Cantola, and Rubio Marin call it, has become a litmus test for the democratic stance of Europe as well. Even in the EU, which some might consider most advanced in terms of gender equality, there are concerning developments, particularly with regard to the rise of far-right parties. Constitutional battles have proliferated, some with some courts accepting and others resisting the challenge of responding to the gradual erosion of gender roles triggered by the advancements in women's rights and sexual minorities. Radical right-wing populist parties with explicit anti-gender, anti-feminist, homophobic, transphobic, anti-immigrant components threaten gender equality. And even where they lack electoral power, research shows that they have serious spillover potential on mainstream political parties. For example, this could take place in the form of backtracking on gender equality commitments, or reorienting sometimes goals or agendas, or at best causing indirect oppositional inertia. In the face of the challenges posed by de-democratization, the liberal social contract, with its gender division in its original formulation, its gender division of productive and reproductive roles, is also limited. Like republicanism in its classical formulations, political liberalism, one might say, has also fallen short of substantiating fully its commitment to the personal is political. And in the face of the failures of neoliberalism, and the crises it creates, right-wing populist policies and discourses such as cash transfers for care, strengthening the family, and or femo-nationalist discourses of protecting women's rights from so-called outside external intruders, that is migrants and refugees, also appeal to segments of women. So what does republicanism, a school of thought that has long appealed to a strict gender distinction between public and the private, and thus has lost the trust of feminism, have to offer to feminist scholarship and politics in such a context? What can feminism offer republicanism? What normative and empirical directions might a critical rethinking of the relationship between the two offer at the beginning of the second centenary of the Republic? So let us go back a century for a moment. As an embodiment of the struggle against monarchy and theocracy, the proclamation of the Turkish Republic in 1923 was crucial in creating a favorable environment for women's struggle for freedom and equality. For the modernizing elite, the project of civilization and westernization were inseparable from the emancipation of women and required the elevation of their status. Since the 19th century, nationalism as the dominant paradigm of modernization and discourses of women's emancipation mutually reinforced each other. The discourses of promoting women's social and political inclusion and women's equality with men circulated among the educated, ethnically and religiously diverse Ottoman elite women who were influenced by Republican and Enlightenment ideas. This vibrant public discourse manifested in journals, associations, salons, contributed to the rapid translation of the idea of equality, as some interpret, into law soon after the establishment of the Republic. The proclamation of the Republic helped to legitimize reforms and advances in women's status. And as Yeşim Arat argues, with the loss of religion as a base of legitimacy, patriarchal oppression inevitably changed and became more moderate. For the Republican elite, the success of the revolution depended on women's emancipation from subjugation, which required emancipation from ignorance through education, the institutionalization of equal status in marriage and before the law. The modern civil code eliminated religious control to a certain extent over the family and subjected it to regulation. Some of the patriarchal underpinnings, as we know, such as the establishment of the man as the head of the family, were revised decades later through the efforts of a broad coalition of women's movement in the late 90s and early 2000s within the political opportunity structure then created by the EU accession negotiations. And contrary to the dominant modernist discourse that women's political rights were handed to them on a golden platter, feminist historians have shown how suffrage was established as the culmination of women's struggle. As early as 1923, Women's People's Party was found. Party's goal was to advance women's interests and ensure women's participation in social and political life. Suffragist discourses were not well received in the existing political and social context. The party was transformed into the Turkish Women's Union, which defined its goal as raising the status of women in intellectual and social life. Women's struggle for political rights received also negative reactions from prominent parliamentarians and some public intellectuals, with some women were ridiculed in daily newspapers, accused of trying to become like men. And suffrage was granted, as we know, at the local level in 1930, at the national level in 1934, and women entered the parliament in 1935, which was also the year the 12th Congress of International Women's Union was held in Istanbul. According to Zafer Toprak, the unexpected politicization of the event, where women from all over the world advocated for peace and democracy, paved the way for the dissolution of the Turkish Women's Union in accordance with the will of the one-party government. This act, which symbolically marked the end of first-wave feminism, was justified by the proclamation that the union had served its purpose and equality had been achieved. From then on, the Kemalist project gave women the responsibility to serve the Republic by educating the nation, being virtuous, pure, and honorable mothers to their children. So I come back to the beginning, to 2023, to a recent essay on the 100th anniversary of the Republic from the perspective of women, written by Aksu Bora. And Bora refers to the dissolution of the Turkish Women's Union and says that such acts of renunciation and compliance by women are never as so simple as they seem. Bora goes on to argue that the taming of the struggle for political autonomy led by and on behalf of women, symbolized by the dissolution of the Union, can be interpreted as a strategic choice that helped achieve political rights earlier than in some other countries. But like any political act, it had a cost, and in this case, the cost was the stalling of women's autonomous political activity until the 1980s. In the dominant feminist history narrative of Turkey, 1980 is a critical date that marks the beginning of the second wave of feminism in Turkey. Beginning in the 1980s, women began to group together independently, independent from unions, from political parties, as feminists, engaging in academic discourses and consciousness raising, but also conducting grassroots campaigns that scrutinized private and social forms of domination. Sevgi Adak and Selin Çağatay, also in an article written in 2023, argue that as a dominant trend in feminist historiography, the use of the wave metaphor in line with its Western counterparts to identify the first wave as the late Ottoman, early Republican struggle for equality, and the second wave as the post-80s grassroots feminist activism, has led to the treatment of the years between 1935, marked by the dissolution of the Union, and 1980, marked by the post-coup revitalization of civil society, as barren years. The literature on the women's movement in Turkey, the emergent literature, shows, however, that far from being barren, the 50s and 60s were home to vibrant and diverse forms of activity, especially by Kemalist and socialist women, as the authors argue. Although they did not call themselves feminists, and here the authors use Moline's term, saying that they articulated women's strategic gender interests in institutions such as associations, trade unions, workplaces, and political parties, anticipating some of the post-80s demands for equal pay for equal work, for instance, reproductive rights, universal childcare, reform of the civil code, and recognition of women's unpaid domestic labor. According to the authors, this account challenges the treatment of the avoidance of mixed gender organizations and autonomy from the state as preconditions or qualifiers of feminist politics in Turkey. In fact, in this latter vein, feminist politics in Turkey has been associated mostly with grassroots feminism and participatory action in the public sphere, very much in line with an Arendtian spirit of civic republicanism, while gender equality advocacy in institutions, including the state, have been sometimes pejoratively labeled as state feminism or project feminism and not treated as the loci of freedom. The The realignment, now going back to feminist political theory, the realignment with republicanism in feminist political theory in the late 90s and early 2000s coincided with a revival of interest in Arendt's work and a celebration of participatory democracy and civic republicanism. And as much as Arendt has been criticized by feminists for excluding from the public much of what is important to feminists, such as the private forms of domination stemming from the gender division of spheres and labor, prominent feminist political theorists such as Bonnie Honig, Mary Dietz, Linda Zerilli have found feminist potential still in Arendt's conception of political action to imagine a radical reconfiguration of the public and private boundaries and a construction of feminist politics that is open to tension, contestation, and difference rather than consensus. Indeed, scholars of feminist politics in Turkey have long been occupied with studying such contestation and tensions within women's movements, feminist movements, and less so with the institutional conditions of freedom, which precludes, I think, a limited engagement with Republican theory. Late 20th century neo-Republican incarnations of Republicanism in political theory, however, focus less on Arendt and more on the dissatisfaction with existing definitions of freedom as freedom from interference. According to Philip Petit, for instance, the defining core of the Republican tradition lies less in ideals of active political participation or the pursuit of the common good than in the notion of freedom as non-domination, which presents a version of republicanism that is far less strict in its separation of public and private concerns. Petit refers to Wollstonecraft's notion that domination by men is the real horror for women to describe domination as the real horror for Republican thought, and in several occasions refers to the domination of women by men to make a case for the conception of freedom as non-domination, and uses Henrik Ibsen's play A Doll's House and the character Nora to explicate this theory of freedom. As you may know, Nora, the main character of the play, is a bourgeois mother of three, married to Torvald, a banker, living in a society where the civil laws and social norms of the time give men the authority to control various aspects of women's lives. However, Torvald does not restrict Nora. He sees her as the jewel of his life, a needy, playful, somewhat naive, sweet woman who needs his protection and guardianship. Nora seems to enjoy the privileges that a banker's wife could enjoy at the time, pretty much, other than forbidding her to eat macaroons, because they damage her teeth. Torvald doesn't interfere much with Nora's choices, and Nora finds a way to hide the macaroons and eat them anyway. When Torvald falls ill and they need a bank loan to go to Italy, Nora manages to get the loan secretly by forging his late father's signature, since it is impossible for her at the time as a woman to get a loan on her own. In short, Nora can get away with pretty much anything that she wants, either through secrecy, deceit, or manipulation, and I think this would be a good moment to recall what Wollstonecraft says about subjugated women not being responsible for their actions of weak moral quality, for subjugation corrupts the powerful and the powerless alike, leaving women little choice but to resort to trickery and cunning. Indeed, another neo-Republican thinker, Quentin Skinner, also describes how domination negatively affects character, and that the constant state of uncertainty it creates in conditions of domination makes people adjust their ambitions, sometimes result to silence or self-censorship. So coming back to Nora, Petit asks the following question, and I quote, "If Torvald does not interfere with Nora's fundamental choices, such as what she wears, who she interacts with, how she maintains the house, etc. He does not restrict Nora except for forbidding her from eating macaroons, and remember, Nora eats them anyway. Can we, under these circumstances, consider Nora to be free?" And Petit argues that from a classical liberal perspective, where freedom is understood as the absence of interference, we might think that Nora is free, but from a Republican perspective, Nora is not free, because the political, legal, and social conditions of the time give her husband, Torvald, the power to arbitrarily influence Nora's choices. As many differences and complexities as there are in Republican thought, freedom refers to the absence of domination. When an individual or an institution has the power to arbitrarily interfere with another's choices, we are talking about a relationship of domination, hence not freedom. In short, if an individual's, and in this case Nora's, choices and decisions about her life are subject to the goodwill and mercy of another person, then we cannot speak of Nora's freedom, and this is independent of whether or not Torvald uses the power given to him by laws and social norms. From this point of view, women who live in societies where there is no equality before law, where they are denied the right to speak for themselves, to control their own lives, decisions, employees who are subject to the arbitrary will of their superiors. In other words, people who live in insecurity, in the shadow of others, as Petit explains, people who cannot look another in the eye without fear of intimidation or rebuke, which he calls the eyeball test, cannot be considered free. Even if these people find a way to exercise their choices and act according to their will, either through deception or cunning, or because those who have power over them do not exercise that power, we still cannot speak of their freedom. According to Petit, in a chapter written last year in a compilation of Republican thought by Oxford Theory, a society is free to the extent that enables its members, at least its adult, able-bodied, relatively permanent residents, to secure the state of free persons and properly defends their basic liberties, ensuring that their choices and ability to make those choices are not blocked, that people are not subject to the control of others to make their choices. So against the evils of public domination, the exercise of political power must be constrained so that government and the state do not operate at will, but the people control the decisions, which requires, of course, a system that is not rigged, an amendable framework, checks and balances, entrenched rights, and venues for contestation. And against the evils of private domination, there should be suitable laws to ensure a basic level of resources and security against disadvantages, including economic ones, and those arising from what Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice. The allure of this concept of Republican freedom for feminists is evident, as it demonstrates that an individual can be deemed unfree under specific circumstances, even in the absence of coercion. But of course, this perspective is not novel to feminists, right? The feminist intellectual tradition already provides a comprehensive theoretical framework for understanding oppression, and as Iris Meryn-Young calls it, its many faces, and its impact on individuals over time, as described by the phenomena of adaptive preferences. So my present discussion does not imply a call for the replacement of feminism with republicanism, nor does it suggest that republicanism should be considered an alternative ally to feminism in lieu of liberalism. Instead, what I'm suggesting is that the investigations of the Republic should be accompanied by an engagement with republicanism also as a theoretical framework for freedom and governance. Well, for one, because it provides a conception of freedom that can be used as a yardstick for scrutinizing both public and private forms of gender domination at work in the Republic. And two, it has important institutional and policy implications for feminist politics that aim at non-domination, and also implications for an education of freedom, which Tuğba Sevinç explicates in an article that is one of the rare works that engages Republican theory from a feminist perspective in Turkey. Freedom as non-domination is attractive to feminists because it points to relations of domination and describes the conditions of being denied status or being unfree. But the feminist reception of neo-Republican theory has not taken the form of full endorsement either. And recent work in feminist, sometimes called critical republicanism, as Laborde calls it, has significantly improved the theory and made it more relevant to understanding contemporary forms of gender, sexualized, racialized, and class domination that archaic references to slavery as a paradigmatic example of domination cannot, which is used in most earlier accounts of Republican theory. In this regard, I find the ongoing debate about whether and how Republican theory can account for structural, impersonal, and intersectional forms of domination, to which scholars such as Gurevich, McBride, Laborde, Gadeke, Kafi contribute important and illuminating. As Gurevich has recently argued, Republican theory can make better sense of structural domination by moving away from agent-centered notions of domination and pre-modern social ontologies towards an understanding of structures that create relations of domination, but also these structures discipline dominators as well. According to the Republican view, domination consists in subjection to a robustly empowered will, and non-domination is secured by constraining the power to interfere through the rule of law and accompanying social norms against arbitrary interference. That is, only interference that is not adequately controlled is dominating. But as Cécile Laborde argues, dominating power does not simply occur in a vacuum. There is often coordination between different empowered wills, and powers of collective will coordination are robustly available across several public possible alternative worlds, which are made resilient by coordination within and between legal systems and social norms. So Laborde says, in contrast to full domination, which is in cases where the dominant will is robustly empowered, for instance, where structural conditions allow someone to act as they please without any checks and controls, contingent domination explains cases of contingent empowerment of dominating wills, such that even when the rule of law exists, certain groups are subject to prejudice, discrimination, long-standing oppression, and they live in the fear of arbitrary interference by others, such as rogue police officers, sexual harassers, and they often feel unfree. In these circumstances, Laborde argues the effective operation of the rule of law is patchy, uneven, and thwarted by the local persistence of oppressive social norms. And it is this local persistence of oppressive social norms that provides the would-be interlopers with allies and a latent power to form coalitions. This, I would say, is precisely what we are seeing around the world today. Orthodox conservative religious organizations, think tanks, powerful NGOs, right-wing political parties, the media, and in some contexts, governments have aligned in a backlash against gender equality, reproductive and sexual rights. These alignments are contingent in the sense that while in some contexts we see coordination between anti-gender and anti-immigrant dominating wills, in the form of, for instance, femo-nationalist, homo-nationalist alliances, in others the coordination is based on anti-Westernism, Euroscepticism, yet in others on homophobia and transphobia. Moreover, a quote-unquote good old patriarchy is made resilient by spillover or at best oppositional inertia, which manifests itself differently in different local contexts and gains resilience from the local persistence of oppressive social norms. In such a context, freedom as non-domination has attractive institutional implications encompassing universities, workplaces, unions, public offices, municipalities, and for localized efforts to promote Republican constitutional, civic, and personal ideals. Gurevich speaks of two different forms of domination that often work together, the capricious element and the regularized and more rationalized element, and gives capitalist domination as the paradigmatic example to it. Despite some of the monolithic readings of anti-genderism that dominate scholarship today, contemporary gendered and sexualized forms of domination also inhabit both the capricious elements of domination, I would say, such as those observed in the discourses of misogynist public figures, some populist politicians, and simultaneous rationalized and regularized element that seeks to create alternative epistemes of gender and sexuality, of the so-called natural order of gender roles, that contingently join forces and also, importantly, gains leeway from the neoliberal domination over women's lives. Over the last decade of AKP rule, more than the last decade, there has been a convergence of neoliberal and neoconservative politics. This convergence has occurred in parallel with a general trend of democratic backsliding and anti-gender politics, which mutually reinforced each other, resulting in adverse impacts of women's rights, gender equality, and sexual rights. As I mentioned in the beginning, a comprehensive process of familialization is currently underway, assimilating women into the family, legitimizing government intervention in the lives of women, LGBTI+, under the guise of safeguarding the family. This process of familialization aligns with neoliberal market demands for flexible, temporary labor, thereby allocating the responsibility of care to families and by extension to women. This dynamic has been particularly detrimental to lower-class women and single mothers who faced heightened interference in their lives and choices. Women without children, Single women, single mothers, LGBTI+ women are excluded from full citizenship, or what Nükhet Sirman refers to as family citizenship. As Erkman observed in a recent article on the 100th anniversary of the Republic, the distinguishing feature of AKP's sacred motherhood discourse compared to earlier iterations of sacred motherhood discourses is its integration of women into responsibilities within both the private and public spheres. The discourse positions sacred mothers, so-called sacred mothers, as caregivers, flexible workers, protectors of conservative gender roles and the family, without providing protection against sexual harassment, gender-based violence, forced child marriages. The pro-natalist, pro-separate sphere's conservative and neoliberal emphasis on the family is a critical central element of the new counter-republican social contract. In this perspective, the civic virtue and patriotism of motherhood is to be demonstrated by bearing children and conducting care work in the private sphere, and simultaneously being vehemently excluded from meaningful participation in the public sphere. And this is accompanied and made possible vis-a-vis another rising phenomenon across the world, and that is increasing violence against women in politics, in civil society, journalism. As Laborde and Sandman argue, even in contexts where an effective rule of law could offer protection from arbitrary interference at the hands of individuals, it cannot offer protection from such interference at the hands of coalitions of individuals who would coordinate to avoid or challenge officers of the state. So what happens in contexts where the rule of law itself is not effective or is thwarted, where coalitions of dominating wills operate across public and private domains? How might the family, economy, workplace, university, public sphere, the state be reimagined according to Republican desiderata, and by whom? How could effective coalitions of freedom operate across various institutional and operational levels of feminist politics? Sylvia Barbie argues that practices and institutions that might re-gender democracy extend wider than parliaments and executives, including legal institutions, the public sphere, organized civil society, and coalitions or sometimes triangles of feminists. I would add that these coalitions of freedom should operate both in the realm of norms and in the realm of laws, bringing together the participatory and the contestatory aspects of Republican politics without valorizing one at the expense of other. Revisiting and promoting the ideals of Republican theory, that is, the personal ideal of freedom as non-domination, the constitutional ideal of a mixed effective democratic regime, and the civic ideal of vigilance and contestation in congruence with critical feminist perspectives that scrutinize contemporary forms of intersectional structural domination is imperative for the future of the Republic and its emergent gender regime and its re-democratization. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Göker. And I think that might also be a good opportunity to transfer these conversations into sort of a more informal way. Please help me to thank Professor Göker once again for her talk. She is going to be here on campus for the next 2 weeks, so take advantage of this and please talk to her right now over lunches, over coffees. This is a wonderful opportunity to have a colleague in our midst who has a specialty that has lots of resonances on this campus. And of course, in this period of time when we are all struggling with issues of backsliding and how to address the various forms of repression and curtailing of our freedoms.
Thank you so much for listening and for